You open your digital banking application and assume that earning more money will magically solve your financial panic. You believe that hitting a massive, specific number will permanently erase the heavy anxiety in your chest. In his 1998 biography, Titan, Ron Chernow describes the young industrialist John D. Rockefeller before he built his massive monopoly. Rockefeller is a young, unknown clerk making a tiny, insignificant wage in a dark, quiet office.
He does not spend his small, hard wages on heavy drinks or expensive clothes to impress his laughing peers. He buys a small, cheap red notebook he quietly calls Ledger A. He writes down every single copper penny he spends with absolute, terrifying precision. He records the exact cost of a single piece of cheap candy and the heavy price of his basic winter coat.
He treats his tiny, insignificant pile of copper coins with the exact same massive respect as a billion-dollar corporate treasury. He understands a fundamental psychological truth that the modern working class completely ignores. If you cannot manage a small, light pile of paper, the heavy universe will never hand you a massive vault. The biological mind must master the heavy discipline before the heavy gold ever arrives. The modern worker operates with the exact opposite psychological framework.
You felt this massive cognitive error last month when you received a small, unexpected tax refund in your digital account. You looked at the extra paper money and immediately viewed it as a massive permission slip to buy a heavy luxury item. You bought the shiny metal object because your fragile ego demanded an immediate, visible reward. You drained the heavy vault the exact moment the heavy iron door finally cracked open.
The people who never go broke possess a massive psychological immune system that aggressively attacks the biological desire to spend unexpected paper. When they receive a massive financial windfall, their heart rate does not elevate. They do not run to the heavy car dealership to upgrade their physical vehicle. They lock the massive paper in the quiet dark. Locking the heavy gold in the dark requires the complete, violent destruction of your own personal vanity.
In his 1974 historical text, The Rise and Fall of the House of Medici, Christopher Hibbert studies the powerful patriarch Giovanni. Giovanni builds a massive, unprecedented banking empire across Europe in the 15th century. He controls absolute financial power, but he deeply recognizes the massive, lethal danger of public display. He calls his ambitious sons into a quiet, dark room and hands them a strict, unbreakable psychological blueprint.
He orders them to never draw public attention to their massive, overflowing vaults. He tells them to dress like ordinary, boring merchants and to ride simple, slow mules through the crowded dirt streets. He completely forbids them from displaying their heavy gold to the hungry, jealous public. He absolutely understands that extreme wealth management is not a simple math problem. It is a massive, unforgiving game, physical and biological survival.
The exact moment the anonymous crowd sees your heavy gold, they begin plotting complex ways to steal it from your quiet hands. The government invents new heavy taxes, and your closest friends arrive with tragic stories demanding heavy loans. Displaying the heavy wealth actively and predictably destroys the heavy wealth. You completely ignored this massive historical lesson last week. You bought a heavy, expensive watch on a terrible installment plan to impress your coworkers at a loud corporate dinner.
You placed the heavy metal on the table and waited for their jealous eyes to validate your entire physical existence. You invited the hungry, desperate wolves to your quiet table just to feel a cheap, fleeting moment of absolute superiority. The true Titan manages money by completely severing their biological ego
from their visible physical consumption. They drive the dull, older car with the peeling paint while holding millions in a quiet, dark brokerage account.
They walk through the loud, crowded mall and feel absolutely zero biological urge. They feel no urge to buy the heavy designer jacket. They view the expensive fabric as a massive, toxic liability. They view the heavy luxury goods as a clever, dark trap designed to steal their finite biological future. When you buy the heavy jacket, you are handing the elite masters another week of your absolute physical labor.
The quiet operator refuses to fund the massive empire with vanity. They preserve the heavy gold to buy their own sovereign physical freedom. Preserving the gold requires a psychological mechanism that forces you to pay your own biological vessel first. In his 1926 book, The Richest Man in Babylon, George Clausen tells the story of Arcad, a poor, exhausted chariot builder. Arcad works his hands to the bone, carving heavy wood for the wealthy elites of the ancient city.
He earns good copper, but his pockets remain completely, terrifyingly empty. He pays the heavy baker for warm bread, the sandal maker for thick leather, and the landlord for a dark room. He pays every single man in the massive city except his own physical self. A wealthy moneylender visits the dusty shop and teaches Arcad the absolute, unshakable law of heavy accumulation. He tells Arcad that a part of all he earns is his to keep forever.
Arcad begins taking exactly 10% of his heavy copper coins and hiding them in the dark earth. He executes this quiet transfer before he pays the angry baker or the loud landlord. He forces his biological lifestyle to shrink and perfectly fit the remaining 90% of his heavy wages. The massive pile of copper in the dark earth slowly begins to grow into a heavy mountain of quiet gold.
You operate your modern digital checking account with the exact mindset of the poor, starving chariot builder. You pay the massive mortgage company, the heavy auto lender, and the loud streaming services the absolute moment you receive your salary. You take the tiny, bleeding scraps left at the end. You foolishly promise yourself to save the tiny scraps at the end of the long month. The tiny scraps always magically vanish before the dark month ends.
The people who never go broke execute the massive extraction first. They set up an automatic, cold, ruthless digital transfer that pulls the heavy investment capital entirely out of their checking account.
The Titan completely hides their massive power behind a perfectly ordinary, completely boring physical disguise. They deeply understand that visible wealth invites massive, unavoidable friction from the heavy legal state and the desperate, hungry crowd. The anonymous crowd will violently try to extract your heavy gold through lawsuits, heavy taxes, and endless guilt trips. The ultimate financial defense is complete, absolute physical invisibility.
Achieving this absolute physical invisibility requires completely severing your emotional attachment to the massive numbers on the digital screen. The people who go completely broke measure their human biological worth by the heavy size of their bank account. When the massive number drops during a violent market correction, their fragile human ego is completely crushed. They fatally attach their fragile soul to the heavy, moving math.
The quiet operator views the massive pile of capital as a simple, cold, mechanical tool. It is exactly like a heavy iron hammer sitting on a quiet wooden workbench in the absolute dark. You do not derive your physical, biological identity from the heavy iron hammer. You simply pick up the massive tool when you need to build a heavy stone wall. You struggle to actively view money this way because you were raised inside the massive, loud consumer matrix.
The massive matrix programmed your fragile brain from birth to equate massive spending with absolute human happiness. You watched the bright, loud television commercials that promised total biological peace if you just bought the heavy, expensive car. You completely believed the massive, highly profitable corporate lie. Extreme money management is the aggressive, daily unlearning of that massive, toxic corporate programming.
It is the sudden, violent realization that buying more heavy metal objects will never fix the quiet, dark void inside your chest. The operator entirely stops trying to fill the biological void with expensive, depreciating assets. They fill the heavy void with absolute, unshakable internal purpose. In the dark, the hedonic treadmill is a massive, heavy biological trap designed to keep you permanently exhausted. You buy the massive new house and feel absolute, pure joy for exactly 3 short weeks.
Then, the human brain rapidly adapts to the extra square footage and the heavy marble countertops. The massive luxury quickly and inevitably becomes your new, boring baseline in the dark. You immediately look over the heavy wooden fence at the neighbor with an even larger, heavier stone house. Your brain violently demands another massive dopamine hit, forcing you to climb further into the dark, crushing debt. The Titan steps completely off this massive, exhausting treadmill.
They find absolute joy in the perfect, simple mechanics of a quiet, functioning life in the absolute dark. The quiet, functioning life requires a massive, ruthless audit of your daily physical habits. The people who eventually go broke slowly bleed their heavy capital through 1,000 tiny, invisible paper cuts. They do not lose their massive fortune in one dramatic, explosive casino bet on the bright floor.
They lose it slowly by subscribing to a dozen heavy digital services they completely forget to use. The quiet operator sits in the absolute dark every single month and brutally slashes the heavy, useless expenses. They view every recurring digital charge as a massive, hostile parasite, actively draining their finite biological energy. They ruthlessly cut the heavy cords to the consumer machine without feeling a single drop of human regret.
They fiercely protect the heavy vault from the tiny, invisible vampires. Protecting the massive vault means saying a permanent, cold goodbye to the people who refuse to understand the heavy mission. The people who eventually go broke surround themselves with loud, desperate friends who constantly demand expensive, heavy entertainment. If you spend your precious time with people who worship the shiny, heavy metal, you will eventually adopt their toxic, bankrupt religion.
This unshakable internal purpose gives the Titan the massive, terrifying strength to say no to the entire loud world. They say absolutely no to the loud, expensive vacations their desperate friends demand they attend. They say no to the heavy, toxic loans their family members desperately beg them to quietly co-sign. They guard the heavy vault door with absolute, ruthless, cold precision.
You are completely too weak to guard the heavy door because you are terrified of disappointing the loud people around you. You handed a massive loan to a friend last year, knowing perfectly well they would never, ever repay the heavy paper. You bought their temporary, fake affection with your own finite biological life energy. You burned your heavy future to keep them warm today. The Titan never sets themselves on massive fire to keep the anonymous, ungrateful crowd warm.
They deeply understand that their first absolute duty is the total, flawless preservation of the heavy capital structure. If the massive capital structure completely collapses, they cannot help anyone in the loud, desperate city. The heavy oxygen mask must go on their own physical face first in the dark. Protecting the absolute structure allows the heavy capital to reach the ultimate phase of massive compounding power.
In his 1996 book, The Millionaire Next Door, Thomas Stanley studies the hidden, quiet lives of the genuinely wealthy elite. He discovers that the massive millionaires do not look like the loud, flashy actors on the bright television screen. They look exactly like your boring, quiet neighbor. They wear cheap, faded jeans and securely buy massive, heavy appliances on a quiet discount sale.
They live in the exact same modest, boring house for 40 straight years, while their massive investment accounts quietly grow into the tens of millions. They never, ever touch the principal of their massive investments. They only consume the quiet, boring dividends that drop from the heavy, invisible tree. They successfully reached a point of absolute financial escape velocity because they completely mastered their own fragile human psychology.
They violently killed the desperate ego. They built the massive, invisible cash moat. And they fully embraced the crushing, absolute boredom. They completely decoupled their internal biological peace from the frantic, screaming noise of the modern, heavy consumer matrix. You are sitting at a massive, heavy crossroads right now, holding your glowing digital phone. You can easily continue to trade your finite biological hours for shiny, heavy objects that inevitably rust in the dark rain.
You can enthusiastically continue to play the massive, rigged status game that guarantees you will eventually die completely broke and exhausted. The heavy wheel will spin you forever. Or you can step entirely out of the loud, screaming arena and bravely begin the quiet, boring work in the absolute dark. You can permanently drop the heavy, desperate need to impress the strangers walking past you on the dirty street.
You can start quietly stacking the heavy, invisible bricks that the massive, violent storm cannot blow away. The choice is entirely your own. The system desperately wants you to gently remain a massive, weak consumer, driven entirely by fragile, fleeting biological impulses. They need you to frantically panic during the fire and to foolishly spend during the quiet peace. They absolutely depend on your complete lack of psychological discipline to build their massive, towering corporate empires.
Your quiet weakness is their massive, heavy strength. The rare individuals who successfully decode this massive psychological architecture become completely, physically untouchable in the absolute dark. They stop uselessly fighting the massive ocean and fiercely learn how to quietly sail the heavy, invisible currents. The historical operators shared their hidden blueprints only with those brave enough to step into the absolute dark to deeply look.
Something on this glowing digital screen is the exact modern version of that ancient, forbidden act of seeking the heavy truth today. Every massive financial illusion in your life, the heavy transfer happens the exact moment the corporate salary hits the quiet bank. They never see the massive paper money, so their fragile human brain never figures out how to physically spend it. They starve their own bad biological habits by actively removing the absolute oxygen from the room. Managing extreme wealth means protecting your heavy capital from your own predictable human weakness.
You cannot trust yourself to make the smart, heavy choice when you are standing in the bright, loud store. The quiet operator removes the heavy choice entirely by locking the money behind an invisible digital wall in the absolute dark. Building that invisible wall requires hoarding quiet cash for reasons the working class completely misunderstands. The average worker views a heavy pile of cash as an invitation. They view the heavy cash as a direct invitation to buy a massive, bigger house. In his 1532 political manual, The Prince, Niccolo Machiavelli advises the wise ruler on the absolute necessity of quiet preparation. He tells the ruler to build massive stone fortresses and heavy, thick earthworks during times of absolute boring peace. He tells them to prepare for the inevitable dark storm.
The foolish ruler dances at the loud, heavy banquets and proudly assumes the quiet peace will last forever. When the massive, violent storm of war suddenly arrives, the foolish ruler is completely swept away in the dark, cold flood. The wise ruler stands safely behind his heavy stone walls and watches the violent storm break against the cold rock. The quiet cash is the heavy stone wall.
The highest level of money management relies on building a massive, untouchable moat of boring cash. This heavy cash is not an investment designed to capture a compounding yield. It is a massive psychological shield designed to completely protect the biological mind from the terrifying chaos of the physical world. The heavy cash sits in the dark vault, doing absolutely nothing but providing pure peace.
You felt the terrifying lack of this heavy shield last winter. Your car engine made a massive grinding sound on the dark, freezing highway. You pulled to the side of the quiet road and felt a cold, crushing panic grip your tired chest. You knew you did not possess the heavy paper money to fix the heavy metal machine. The emergency was a total financial disaster.
For the quiet operator holding a massive, invisible cash moat, the broken engine is not a heavy disaster. It is a minor, boring administrative task. They make a quiet phone call, pay the massive towing fee without checking their digital balance, and return to their deep sleep. They use their heavy, boring cash to completely buy their way out of the human biological panic.
When you permanently eliminate the biological panic, your fragile brain is completely free to make massive, cold, logical decisions. The people who go broke constantly make terrible, desperate choices because their biological back is violently pressed against a heavy, cold wall. They take the terrible, toxic job offer because they need the immediate paper check to avoid sudden eviction. Desperation forces the heavy hand.
The titan holding the heavy cash moat looks at the toxic job offer and quietly walks away in the dark. The massive cash allows them to sit in absolute silence and wait for the perfect, heavy opportunity. They negotiate from a position of unshakable, terrifying strength because they do not desperately need the other man's heavy money. The boring cash moat buys the ultimate heavy leverage.
Protecting that heavy leverage requires an extreme psychological mutation when the entire global market completely collapses. In his 1954 book, The Great Crash 1929, economist John Kenneth Galbraith details the absolute biological panic of the massive financial collapse. The loud, wealthy bankers watch their heavy stock portfolios vaporize in a matter of terrifying, chaotic hours. The crowd screams in the dark streets and jumps from windows.
The average human brain is biologically wired to run away from the massive, terrifying fire. When the digital portfolio bleeds heavy red numbers, the weak investor feels absolute physical pain. They log into their digital account with shaking hands and sell their heavy, valuable assets for a tiny fraction of their true worth. They sell the heavy gold to stop the biological pain in their chest.
The master of extreme money management flips this exact biological script in the absolute dark. They deeply train their mind to view the massive, terrifying fire as the ultimate
rare, heavy opportunity. When the blood runs in the loud streets and the weak hands drop the heavy assets, the quiet titan steps out of the shadows. They deploy the massive cash moat to buy the heavy world.
You completely failed this massive psychological test during the last massive economic downturn. You read the terrifying, screaming headlines on the bright digital screen and felt absolute fear. You stopped your automatic investments and hoarded your tiny scraps of cash while waiting for the absolute end of the world. You let the loud, panicked media completely steal your massive financial future.
The elite operator entirely ignores the loud, screaming television and looks at the cold, hard mathematics. They understand that every massive fortune in human history was built by quietly buying heavy assets when the anonymous crowd was absolutely terrified. They act with cold, mechanical ruthlessness, while the rest of the world completely loses its fragile mind. Panic is the ultimate heavy, massive discount. Buying the massive discount requires an iron stomach, but holding the heavy asset requires mastering absolute, crushing boredom. In his 1953 story, The Man Who Planted Trees, Jean Giono describes a quiet shepherd named Elziard Bouffier. The shepherd lives in a desolate, barren valley where absolutely nothing grows and the dry wind howls. He walks across the empty, dead earth every single day.
He carries a heavy iron rod and a small sack of simple acorns. He punches a massive hole in the hard dirt and drops a single seed into the absolute dark. He plants 100 heavy acorns every single day in absolute silence. He does not expect to see a massive, towering oak tree the following morning. He completely understands the absolute scale of deep time.
The people who never go broke treat their massive investment portfolios exactly like the quiet, lonely shepherd. They drop the heavy index funds into the dark account every single month without fail. They do not log in the next morning to check the daily percentage change. They do not trade the heavy assets based on a frantic rumor they heard in the loud, crowded office.
The modern financial matrix is completely designed to cure your biological boredom with loud, flashing colors. The massive brokerage applications send you bright notifications and loud alerts to strictly trigger your daily dopamine. They desperately want you to trade the heavy assets because they collect a massive, invisible toll on every single chaotic transaction. Constant activity completely destroys the heavy, compounding portfolio. You downloaded a massive trading app last year and bought a highly volatile company because your loud friends recommended it. You stared at the glowing line moving up and down the bright screen for hours. You felt like a massive financial genius for a single, fleeting week. Then, the massive line completely crashed and you lost your entire heavy investment in the dark.
The quiet operator understands that true wealth management is the most boring, unexciting activity on the physical planet. It is literally watching heavy, invisible paint dry on a dark wall for 30 long years. They set the massive, heavy compounding machine in absolute motion and walk completely away from the bright screen. They lock the heavy door and throw the iron key into the deep ocean.
The absolute discipline to remain completely bored protects the vault from the massive danger of sudden lifestyle inflation. In his 1899 text, The Theory of the Leisure Class, Thorstein Veblen observes the desperate biological desire of the middle class to constantly mimic the absolute elite. When a poor man earns a heavy pile of gold, he immediately buys a massive, shiny carriage.
He buys the heavy carriage to frantically prove to his old, poor neighbors that he has finally escaped the dirty mud. He spends his entire heavy fortune maintaining the shiny carriage and feeding the expensive horses. He completely forgets to buy the heavy producing land that actually generates the quiet gold. He buys the massive costume of wealth, but he remains a complete peasant.
The psychology of extreme money management demands the absolute, violent rejection of the visible status upgrade. When the quiet operator doubles their massive corporate salary, their physical daily life remains completely, absolutely identical. They do not move to the loud, expensive neighborhood with the heavy, restrictive gates. They do not buy the massive, heavy watches or the loud, branded luxury clothing.
You are secretly terrified of living this quiet way because you require the constant, cheap validation of the anonymous crowd. You believe that accumulating a massive, heavy fortune is completely pointless if you cannot excitedly show it to your jealous friends. Your fragile ego absolutely demands the heavy spotlight. And that exact spotlight will eventually burn your entire financial fortress to the ground.